Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Boardwalk webinar talking about blockchain in the enterprise and what can you do with it today. We're glad to have so many people joining us. This turns out to be a topic of great interest across the extended community that we try and touch. I'm here today with Glenn Cordingley. He's joining me to walk you through a presentation and kind of give you a view of what we're seeing in the marketplace today and the things that you can do and to get started with blockchain today, because everybody's talked about in previous years what is blockchain, and now everybody's saying, well, how can I take advantage of it and apply it to my business, which is what we're going to focus on. We're going to go through a presentation, then we're going to do a demonstration. We tend to get a lot of questions as we go through this, so we likely will not be able to answer them all, but if you have any questions, please use the question feature of GoToWebinar on the little control panel, and we'll be sure to follow up with you directly with any of your questions. With that being said, I'll introduce Glenn, and away we'll go, and hoping everybody enjoys the next hour.
Thank you, JV. Hi, everyone. This is Glenn Cordingley. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Boardwalk Tech. I've been with Boardwalk Tech about 12 years. And have worked with many of our enterprise clients over the years as we've deployed our digital ledger-based applications for our clients. So blockchain is certainly something that's on everyone's mind. And if you look at the McKinsey quote here, nothing less than the second generation of the internet, it will change every institution in some ways more than the first generation did. Pretty astounding statement. And then from IDC saying nearly 6 in 10 of large corporations are either actively considering or in the process of deploying blockchain technology. Another interesting quote, and I have some more comment on that as we go along. But the real question is your enterprise prepared, and how? How are you going to leverage blockchain as we go into the future? So blockchain is about more than cryptocurrencies. So, we're going to assume that, there's a kind of quite a varied level of understanding on the call today about what blockchain is. So we'll do a little bit of background. We've been studying blockchain now for some time. And so, we'll try to provide that perspective to you. So as we show here, blockchain it is not just about cryptocurrencies. I mean, everyone's familiar with the stories about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and how Bitcoin is a lot of fluctuation in pricing. And you may know that blockchain was invented to support Bitcoin. That's how blockchain came to be, and it was invented by a gentleman in Japan who was trying to figure out how to disintermediate the banking system so that people could trade currencies without banks. And the basic problem he was trying to solve was the double payment problem. So if I was to transfer Bitcoin to JB, what's to say that I can't trade and transfer that same Bitcoin to someone else? And that's why we have banks. And so blockchain was invented as a method by which you could avoid that problem. And it's a very complicated and mathematically rich solution that solves that particular problem for that particular kind of blockchain. What we're going to talk about today is the application of blockchain to the enterprise, which is very different. And blockchain really, the basic idea of blockchain is, how do I elevate the level of trust in multi-party networks so that I can improve processes, I can disintermediate steps, or, as in the financial markets, how they talk about disintermediating the necessity to do reconciliation kinds of processes, clearance kind of processes. But in the enterprise, there's lots of places that you can apply this technology as well. And we're seeing it it can apply across, finance, CRM, PLM, human resources, supply chain management across the board, and with all kinds of companies and all kinds of different application domains. And we see lots of different companies that are in the blockchain market today. Some of the major ones, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, and of course, we're in the market, Boardwalk Tech as well. I think it's also interesting that, the CEO of IBM, a few months ago at a conference with her own people at IBM, talked about that they were betting the company on 3 technologies. And one of those 3 technologies was blockchain. And I thought that was a pretty astounding thing for IBM to come out and publicly state that they're going to be focusing that heavily and investing that heavily in blockchain. So there are these different kinds of blockchains, as I've already mentioned. At the bottom here, you've got, permissionless public blockchain that supports Bitcoin, for example. You have a category which are permissioned public blockchains, where there is some permissioning that's done by a central organization that allows people to join, but basically all the data is shared across all the nodes in a blockchain network. But the area that we're going to focus on, and specifically for the enterprise, is permissioned private. And this is where you have multi-party networks where not everyone is going to see all of the information. In addition, you may have networks where a single party is going to want to be a controlling party in a particular multi-party network. For example, a manufacturer and all of its suppliers. That manufacturer is going to be the controlling party in that kind of a private permission blockchain network, because they're going to want to control what can happen, who can see what, because they're the dominant force in that particular multi-party network. So although in the beginning I referenced the IDC quote about 6 in 10 are seriously considering or actually deploying blockchain, it's interesting. I had a meeting recently with a CIO of about an $8 billion company, and it was very interesting. The CEO was, like many CIOs, very interested in understanding where are things going with blockchain. And this CIO was trying to figure out how do they get out ahead of this. And she told me the story of how her CEO had been talking with one of the executives at IBM who had said, you really need to be adopting blockchain. And so, of course, the CEO came back to the CIO and said, hey, what are we doing in blockchain? And she said, well, nothing right now. And as she told me the story, she said that she happens to be on a council of, about 150 CIOs in her particular industry. And that in a particular meeting, the question was raised to the council saying, how many people are actually doing something with blockchain right now? And it turned out that no one in that particular council of CIOs was doing anything concrete other than considering things in blockchain. The question is, why is that? Why is it with all of the possibility with blockchain, why is it that there's very little happening right now? There are some pilots, there are some POCs, but there are not a lot of deployments today. So we think that there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is, in order to deploy a blockchain application, you've got to get everyone to play, right? So if you hear about these use cases around, for example, in supply chain, provenance of goods, tracking goods back to the source. I need to get everyone in that particular network to be participating in order to add value and to be able to run a blockchain application. And they may not want to invest in blockchain. How do I get everybody to do that? I'm not going to pay for everyone else to do it. The other thing is that blockchain is, we're going to talk more about what is blockchain, but, it's entering transactions into blocks that are secured mathematically, so we know that those transactions are true and valid and can't be tampered with. Now, the enterprise is a very complicated place. And if I'm just going to enter the end transaction into blockchain, what about all the processes that are involved in front of that transaction that happen inside the enterprise? So the integration with the existing processes is a big part of making a blockchain application work, but it's not something that people are talking much about. So the blockchain application is really only the tip of the iceberg. Now, I don't know if you've looked at how would you build a blockchain application today. There are different tools out there. There are different languages that are being used, like the Go language, for example, to build blockchain applications. It's very, very tedious and laborious to build these applications. So it takes time, and I would say that's another obstacle is people don't have the skills, they don't know how to do it. And if I go to one of the larger vendors to say I want to do a POC, you're starting at $250,000 plus just to do a POC, and to get them to help you to do the coding in order to try to build a blockchain application, and you still haven't integrated with anything else in your company. So we think those are some of the reasons why adoption has been slow with blockchain. And we have, in the way that we approach blockchain, as we'll talk about, we have a solution to this particular issue. So let's talk about how they work a little bit here. So specifically with enterprise private permission blockchain, you've got multiple parties creating and storing transactions on a digital ledger. So a digital ledger is really the centerpiece of the blockchain idea. Some people liken it to think of it as a shareable spreadsheet that sits, somewhere that everyone has access to, that stores data across time, where the transactions are captured and linked and chained and can't be tampered with. So if a transaction's entered into that spreadsheet ledger, we know it's true and it can't be tampered with. And the way we do that is through, on the right-hand side of this, is through cryptographic algorithms or hashing. And basically what I can do is I can run hashes that take transactions, and I can run a hash against the transaction, and I can stick the hash in the next transaction so that those are inexorably linked, and that you can make sure that those transactions are not tampered with, because you can go back and run that hash again, and if the hash doesn't come out the same way, you know the transaction has been tampered with. Now, the other thing is that in private permissioned blockchain, not all the nodes, and I mentioned this before, are going to synchronize all the transactions. You're going to have selective transactions. You don't want everyone to see all the data or all the transactions in the network. This is true especially in the enterprise. And again, if I go back to somebody like, Apple and its contract manufacturers, they're going to want only Foxconn to only see the stuff that they're supposed to see, and Sanmina to only see the stuff that they're supposed to see, for example. So let's talk about, there's often discussions about, well, I've got this idea for a blockchain, but is it really a blockchain application? Maybe it's just a distributed database application, or maybe it's, some other way to solve it. They don't really need blockchain. So what are some of the categories that we would look at to determine whether something's a blockchain application? And this is from PwC, something that they put out. So the first one is that multiple parties are going to share data. They need views of common information. Multiple parties are going to update data. They're going to take actions that need to be recorded and change the data. So again, if you go back to the spreadsheet analogy, if I've got a shareable spreadsheet across time that I can allow multiple people to interact with, it's kind of the model to think about for this. I have a requirement for verification. Participants need to trust that the actions are recorded and valid, right? So if I'm going to disintermediate steps in a supply chain process, then, and it's with parties who don't trust each other fully. I mean, I have a partner, I trust them, but I don't trust them all the way. I have to make sure that the transactions that are entered into the ledger are absolutely true and valid, and everyone has to be able to verify it, and they have to believe it, because otherwise you won't be able to eliminate those steps. Number 4, the intermediaries have to add complexity. And so removal of intermediaries can reduce cost and complexity. So for example, let's say, I've got lots of invoice reconciliation steps in a supply chain process. How can I eliminate those steps through elevating the level of trust and the ability to verify transactions in my network? I could eliminate a lot of waste and a lot of time. Maybe I could speed payments. Maybe I'd be able to then negotiate better prices, for example, with my suppliers. They should be time sensitive. So reducing delay has a business benefit. And the transactions interact. Transactions created by different participants depend on each other. So again, as in the Apple Foxconn example, Foxconn enters a transaction that depends on Apple and vice versa. So let's look at sort of the before and after. Today we see that there is no ledger. And what happens is we've got multi-party networks where people are sending data back and forth through email. There's a lot of manual data manipulation. There's a lot of spreadsheet use, a lot of inefficiency, very expensive, and very time-consuming. And if you think about the way that the enterprise has evolved over the last 10 years, the enterprise has really gone from a central, monolithic, kind of a, focused organization to one where the business processes are becoming much more distributed, right? Our interactions with our partners, we had interactions with our partners, but now those interactions with our partners are incessant. And they're crucial to the efficiency and the execution of our business. So the focus has gone from the center to the periphery and to the spaces between the parties. And so this inefficiency that we see that is, consistent throughout the enterprise, it's extremely important to solve that problem as we go forward in the future. Now, on the right-hand side with blockchain, now we've got a shareable digital ledger, and we have the ability for multiple parties to interact in a parallel way versus in a serialized way, as we have done in the past. We also have the ability to, have digitally signed and encrypted transactions, and we're, distributing transactions and sharing transactions with all the parties. So you've got consensus, provenance, or where has this come from, and the immutability, the trust, and the finality of the transactions. So let's talk a little bit about what Boardwalk brings to the table. We've been building digital ledger-based applications for over 10 years. We have a patent on the way we manage information that enables us to do that. It's a temporal, think of us as a temporal data environment where we already have I use the analogy of a central shared spreadsheet in a way, right? We use a grid model on our back end for our digital ledger, and people can, in parallel, work against that grid over time without having locking or serialization come into play. So that's the essence of the top technology that Boardwalk has. And so we've been building applications for 10 years using that. We also have been linking transactions as well. So we've been linking transactions so that those transactions are immutable and they can't be tampered with, because we're storing the transaction and then we're linking the transactions as well. And now we've added the blockchain capability of the hashed transactions that puts sort of the final bow on the blockchain capabilities of Boardwalk. So you look at the top here, we start with our digital ledger, which is sort of the center of our core technology, immutable address value, and immutable on and off-chain transactions. We have a smart contract designer, which we'll talk about a little bit, tamper-proof auditability, versioning and change management. We have permission and access control out of the box, workflow-based consensus. We were awarded an integration award from Gartner a few years ago for our integration framework that we use for connecting our capabilities with other data sources in the enterprise. We use a trusted third-party model. So we're specifically focused in permission private blockchain, where you've got a third party who may be one of the parties in the network is acting in that role of being in charge of the network, and and although the rules have to be agreed to by all the parties in the multi-party network or in the consortium, there is someone who's controlling that network in this private permission blockchain. Now, the last one is an important point. We talked a lot about what are some of the barriers to people adopting blockchain. And one of those barriers is you've got to get everyone to play, and they're going to have to invest. That's number one. And number two, well, let's look at that one. So with the Boardwalk virtual machine, we're able to connect with multiple parties and to integrate with their existing processes so that they can participate in a blockchain application without having to sign up for a blockchain node or sign up for a blockchain service. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that, let's say I'm a Brocade and I want to implement a supply chain blockchain solution with my suppliers. But I'm not going to be able to get all my suppliers to sign up for this. Using Boardwalk, I can take my existing process that I may be using today that's got legacy Excel, it's got a lot of manual data handling, a lot of dumping data out of enterprise systems. I can use the Boardwalk blockchain environment to set up a blockchain application that has all of the components that I need and that can enable a supplier to download a virtual machine and interact in that blockchain network. And they don't have to sign up for it. And I've integrated with the existing processes in that multi-party network today. So I've reduced the amount of change management, I've limited the amount of investment, and I've increased the ROI to getting to blockchain using this particular approach. In addition, I've provided an on-ramp really for the enterprise to get to blockchain, because once you've deployed the Boardwalk Digital Ledger and you're storing transactions like this, you then can communicate with, let's say, one of your big partners who's bigger than you says, you have to now comply. I'm using IBM's Hyperledger Fabric, and you need to talk to that network. Boardwalk can supply the transactions to that blockchain network so that you can have an integrated communication with your big partner who's insisting that you play on this particular thing. So if I can kind of summarize our approach is to start with the digital ledger, because I often hear people say, well, I'm really interested in this, but I'm struggling with the use cases. And Because the use cases that people talk about are so big in a lot of ways, right? I want to do provenance of goods. I got to get everybody I got everybody on board with this thing. But what about starting with multi-party supply chain processes that you have in place today, where you can implement the digital ledger as the starting point and then elevate it to the level of blockchain transactions as you move towards integration with the blockchain over time. And that's what we're offering our customers today. So you can see here, starting in the center with digital transformation around the patented digital ledger, integration with legacy applications, enabling multi-party collaboration through this digital ledger solution, and integration with enterprise systems and applications. And that's across the board in all different areas of the business. So let's talk a little bit about more about how it actually works. So with Boardwalk, as I said, the centerpiece is this digital ledger, and you can implement any UI against the digital ledger to access and view data and interact with data from the Boardwalk digital ledger. Now, one of the things that's unique about our back-end technology, which I'll talk about in a second, is that because we are working with a grid, our patent is this ability to work with this grid idea in the back end of our system. We're able to take models that people have created in the enterprise, and we have a tool that can take a model from legacy Excel, for example. So let's say you have a legacy Excel model, and in that legacy Excel model, you're capturing a lot of your IP for your processes. You're doing supply planning, you're doing demand planning. You've got intellectual property you've baked into these models that represent the way your business operates. And today, we're stuck in these manual processes because enterprise systems aren't flexible enough to replace these manual processes that we have, and it's slowing us down. And as the enterprise continues to accelerate towards distribution with these multi-party networks, it's going to become more and more of a problem. So with Boardwalk, we're able to take an Excel model, a legacy Excel model, and I can dynamically take that, and using our toolkit, I can load that into the digital ledger as instantiation time T0 in the ledger. So think of it as I've taken an Excel grid and I've mapped it into my digital ledger grid as time T0. And then using out-of-the-box technology that we have, we're able to configure an application around that digital ledger instance. And so what would take 6 months for somebody to build using other tools, we can typically do in 6 weeks using our technology. Now let's talk about, with the digital ledger, I've mentioned that we store data over time. And so we give you the ability to be able to look into the ledger and to say, I want to understand how this data, I want to be able to look at these transactions. What's happened over time? And so I could go in and I could say, show me all the transactions across time. Show me, and that's what you're seeing here at the top of this slide. You're seeing Rep 1, when it was updated, what the comment was, and what happened in the grid, so that I know what changes have been made against the grid over time. I could take a specific transaction, and I could open that up, and then you'll see the second grid below it, where it's showing, for this particular transaction, this is what happened. These are the changes that were made. I can see that these particular cells in the grid were actually changed in these particular ways. In addition to that, I can go at the cell level, and I can say, for this particular cell in the grid, show me what happened over time. So the final little matrix or grid here, I can see that for that particular value, it was 100 and a formula was changed. Before that it was 90, before that it was 102, before that it was 140. So I have all that information at my fingertips, and I can see exactly what's changed. Now I'm going to go really quickly just through this to give you a flavor for our positional grid model in terms of the IP that we have. But this is very different than managing data in SQL or NoSQL. And I'm just going to buzz through this very quickly. The basic idea is that we use global addresses. So think about it. We have a grid object that we have a global address for. That global address is good globally across systems. And I can assign different tags and semantics against that global address. It could be a commit date. It could have a season, summer of 2018. It might have a category for women. So for example, if this was in the apparel space. In addition to that, I can say for commit date, I can link values to that global address. Okay? And those values can change over time without locking. I'm not locking it. I'm actually allowing it to flow through time, and I can allow multiple people to assign values against that global address over time. So we're allowing parallelization, and this is really important in work in process models in supply chain in the enterprise. If you think about the way it works, you've got multiple people working on these processes where they want to evolve processes over time. There are lots of people having input on those processes, and values can move through different dates that they take on over time, and then eventually they resolve to a final state. And Boardwalk allows that without locking. And that's one of the key aspects of our technology. And any type of data can be contained as a value. So for example, not only can I store a value and link it to the address, but I could store a formula and link it. I could store an image or a document or other user-defined attributes. So this is really the power behind Boardwalk's technology that we've been in the market with for 12 years. So a couple of other key differentiators about our technology. I mentioned earlier about how, you know, typically it takes 6 months to build an application versus Boardwalk, it takes 6 weeks. So this is because of the way of our grid model is a single model that we use, right? Most of the time when you build an application, you have to create a new data model every single time. With Boardwalk, you don't have to do that. We have a single model that works for everything. And so when we start out of the box on the bottom, we've got the schema, the object mapping, the access control, the workflow, and the information exchange. That's all out of the box with Boardwalk. And what remains to be done is the business logic. Whereas if you use other tools that are out there today, you have to write all this stuff from scratch. And if you've looked at any of the videos, you know, go look at a video of Hyperledger Fabric and how do you write, you know, how do you write this stuff? I mean, it's pretty detailed and tedious. I also mentioned our ability to uniquely, up at the left-hand side here, integrate with legacy Excel. It's a critical point here because it's the thing that gives you the ability to get to a blockchain application as an evolutionary approach, as opposed to a revolutionary approach with trying to build a blockchain from the outside in. We're saying you can build it from the inside out. Take existing processes and let's inject a digital ledger and blockchain into your existing processes, integrate with those processes, and get all the benefits associated with improved efficiency and effectiveness in the execution of those processes. And finally, the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, that because of the virtual machine, I can get people involved without having to get them to actually sign up and invest in a blockchain solution. One other key point here is that you know, in traditional systems, if you looked at a record like this, a record would have to be locked. People would operate on that record, and then it would have to be unlocked for somebody else to be operating on it. With Boardwalk, these fields that are shown inside this record are all independent, and they could come in from different data sources. They could come in as payments. They could come in from user entry. They could come in from other blockchains, and they're all being operated on independently in the Boardwalk Digital Ledger. This is why we were given an award by Gartner for our integration framework, is because of the uniqueness of the way that we're able to integrate with other sources around the enterprise and pull that in and be able to operate it on it this particular way. So Boardwalk is an on-ramp for enterprises to adopt blockchain technology in the way that we described. It'll work across all applications. It can work in any kind of company and industry, and we can even integrate with other blockchain solutions that, you know, come down the line, so that as you integrate with Boardwalk and our digital ledger, you're actually preparing yourself for the future of blockchain. These are some of our customers that we're working with today. And I'm going to have JB walk through a couple of use cases and then give you a demo.
And these are just some examples of multi-party applications that we see with enterprise clients. And I think it's important for each of you to look at your business and say, you know, all of you are already embarking down this process of digital transformation. And as you do this, try and focus on the types of things that are costing money for your business. And then also consider all the additional capabilities that you're able to bring and apply to your business by applying blockchain for having the trust and the verification and everything else that's associated with transacting and interacting with all your multiple parties. And generally what we see across the board is kind of summarized up on the top here about, you know, if you're able to apply this digital transformation across all the different types of processes in your business, then almost without exception, you're able to move from, in most cases, monthly processes to weekly processes. And this is where there's a tremendous amount of savings that happens from the business to be able to do things quicker, which effectively frees up what we call a working capital for not only the individuals associated with this to be able to focus on going multiple times against something, but the business has an opportunity to not plan once, but plan 4 times in a given month instead of just once. And if you take that and kind of apply it across the business, then it has a huge impact, because if you're planning better, then you're going to be able to reduce inventory, which of course has an impact directly on the bottom line, not only for you, but for all your trading partners. And as you look at your businesses, like in the case of apparel, there's so many different touch points right now that are multi-party interactions between different people that you need to be able to take these, automate them, and then also focus on the capability of saying, hey, once I've done this production commit with my supply chain, I need to have a ledger environment that's driven by blockchain that provides an irrefutable truth to say, okay, this is what we agreed to, so therefore now I can execute a payment against this or release a purchase order. And today all of that work is being done manually. And blockchain, offers the promise of being able to provide verification around this so that you're further able to automate it. And this really, applies across all businesses, not just apparel, but even in CPG, where you're doing electronics and you need to be able to go up and down the supply chain to suppliers, to contract manufacturers, out to resellers, into your customer care operations, and be able to touch all these different parts of the business. And this is really why we showed that, or talked about the difference between a cryptocurrency Bitcoin environment, which is a very simplistic data model, and data models that are typical for companies in electronics, companies in insurance. Another example of clients that are doing work where you have all of these different data elements and you need to be able to have them working together, transform so that they're automated, but also be able to have this record that without any opportunity for having it being modified, you're able to see exactly what people have done and control the trust and verification of the data. And then the last example is just in the food and beverage space. Again, as you go up and down the supplier value chain, and you need to be able to touch all the different people, we see this consistently that for one client, for example, Coke working with Walmart, the data requirement to work with Walmart is different than the data requirement to work with Safeway. And unless you have a digital ledger environment that's able to effectively work with all this different type of information, then it makes it very hard to put this transformation in place. And it also makes your whole blockchain strategy ineffective because you're not able to capture and apply it to the information that really drives the process. So let's look at the demo scenario, because this will be illustrative about how this can work. And in this case, we're going to use the example of a bill of material management between multiple trading partners, where this particular company, Acme Electronics, has a set of BOM data that comes through integration into their working environment. And then this information needs to be shared across multiple contract manufacturers to say, hey, this is the requirement for the number of parts that I need by a specific time, but there has to be an interaction back and forth between the manufacturer and the contract manufacturers to say, when can I get this information, what quantity, what price? And this is done today many times manually, but as you go through this digital transformation, if you stop at the point where I'm just connecting these pieces together, which is what we've been doing for 10 years, then you still have to have a whole follow-on process to say, what did we agree to, and does everybody agree to that? And consequently, can we pay it or release this invoice or these other things? And this is what blockchain provides. It's this opportunity to pull data out of a collaborative process between multiple parties and say, here's the key transactional information that defines the interaction between these parties. And I want to be able to put this on a blockchain and make it irrefutable and tamper-proof so that nobody can impact it or change it, and it can be used as a basis to support faster payments, free up of cash, and everything else that's associated with that. So let's go over and jump into one of the virtual machines. In this case, this is a virtual machine running inside of an Excel environment. And as Glenn has mentioned, the Boardwalk Digital Ledger is a grid-based data management system. So it's able to use any of your legacy data environments inside of Excel or transactional systems to say, what is the data that I'd like to be able to collect? So in this case, there's BOM numbers and different contract manufacturers and invoice information. And then there's also collaborative information that needs to be lined up with this. So in this case, there's some commentary that goes along with the particular set of exchanges back and forth between Acme and its contract manufacturers. But then there's also a subset of the data that is specifically going to be used to be captured on the blockchain. And this is where the Boardwalk solution is very different in its ability to manage these cells of data within a grid and independently version them over time, which means in this particular case, what we're looking for is the order status being completed. And if the order status is completed, then take this transaction record and the key items associated with it in terms of who's the contractor manufacturer, what was the amount, and apply that to the blockchain and have the blockchain capture this irrefutable hash that says, hey, here's the state of the data. It can't be changed. And make that available to the selected parties so that when they're looking at history, there's a single version of this truth and it can't be modified by anybody else. And then the access control, as Glenn said in the beginning, is a really important part for this. And within the Boardwalk environment, it works exactly like an auto filter. So within a grid, you've got these columns that are saying BOM item, order detail, order status. Well, there's one of them called CM, contract manufacturer. So in the Boardwalk data environment, we're able to go in and say, well, who are the users that are interacting with this? And these users are just presented here for the purposes of configuration, but of course, these are user credentials that are managed through single sign-on. You're able to apply the public and private keys as necessary in order to support the interaction. But when the people are actually touching the ledger, from a business perspective, you make it very simple for them to say, hey, well, this user, I want them only to see rows where Foxconn shows up in the grid and not see anything else. And with every other system, you have to go through a very difficult process of doing configuring and slicing for being able to do this. Whereas in the Boardwalk environment, it's essentially the same as saying, hey, how would I apply a filtering to this like I would with an auto filter? And I'd like to have that show up and drive the data interaction. So, how does this work? Well, people log into the system, and when they log into the system, whether it's inside of an Excel VM or inside of a browser, they get authenticated. And I'm going to jump over now and say, well, what would the Foxconn person see? So here's the Foxconn user environment, and as noted because of the access control, they only see the rows here where Foxconn shows up. They don't see any other sets of data. And this is a very important part for enterprise blockchain environments, is to make sure that the channel is limited to the data that the individual can see. But now I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, I'm going to make this be completed, and I'll make this be 9700, and I'll say this is final. And now when I'm ready, I'll say, okay, well, I want to be able to submit this to the Boardwalk ledger. So at this point it says, well, who are you? So there's a login event, and then it says, for today, this is a comment that describes the intent of what you're doing. And then this is when the smart contract gets executed to say, for this data that has been submitted, has an order status reached a completed state? And if so, commit this transaction information to the blockchain and generate a hash that shows, or not shows, but captures the exact data that's been submitted by this user. So here we're tying enterprise information associated with the transaction and saying, I want to be able to support all of the data. So for example, the comments are not necessarily going to be committed, which is what we talk about for WIP, because you may go back and forth between all the parties and not get to completed. You may have things that are new. You may have things that are, delayed. And you want to be able to have the provenance of that, which you get in the Boardwalk digital ledger. But then when you'd like to have a finalized transaction that supports an interaction between the parties, you'd like to be able to leverage the capabilities of the blockchain. So this has been Excel. Equally, you can leverage a browser. So if I log in now as Sanmina and I say, hey, I want to be able to take a look at the data inside of a browser. So now I'm looking at that same work order processing data digital ledger, but I'm only seeing the rows for Sanmina. So if I come in here and I say changes, and then I say submit this, and now I'm saying these are my updates as Sanmina, I've now done the same thing. I'm presenting a grid, which is a digital ledger that users can interact with, and providing this capability to do what we call refresh and submit for updating the data and making changes and pushing it back to the ledger. Well, the reflection of that is that as soon as it's entered into the ledger, it's available from a collaborative point of view for other users. So now if I go back to where I started with Acme, and I log in as the process owner for Acme, and I say, hey, refresh this grid from the ledger and update my VM with the changes, then I'm going to see here that some changes have been done. So you can see here that this data value has been updated. You can see that this data value has been changed from 9,500 to 9,700. You can see the comment that I put in both as Foxconn, right? But then also, here's the change that was done by Sanmina. And you can also see when was the change done for the blockchain that was added. And then also, when was this updated? And as Glenn showed, you can take any one of these and say, wow, I don't think this price is the right price. How many times has this been changed? And if I say, well, show me a history of the changes to this cell over the past week, then on demand, it goes back to the ledger and it says, show me the changes that have been done and who's done them. And this is not anything that has to be programmed. With other database environments, for example, if you have a key value pair database that you're looking at, where are you going to store all the historical records? Right? You have to come up with a scheme for not overwriting, but you have to come up with a mechanism to store those in the correct order and then be able to retrieve them and understand time, and that's not something that's inherently part of these applications. But the Boardwalk Digital Ledger understands grids of data. So now I'm saying, go ahead and show me a history of the updates to this database. And as you can see, what it's doing is it's saying, who is the person that has created an update for this? When did they do the update? And then exactly what did they do? They added rows, deleted rows, changed formulas, updated cells, and you can control what people are able to do and not do. But the Boardwalk Digital Ledger is keeping track of all of the transactional information that's happening in the process and the off-chain data, both WIP and transactional information. And it's also submitting information to the blockchain itself. So let's take a look at what the blockchain would look like. Well, if I say, okay, let's go back and say, take a look at the blockchain. So here are the transactions that have been submitted to the block. And here you can see the hash code that was put in place. And if I want to be able to validate these, I can go in and I can say, well, let's take a look at this one and validate it. And you can see that when it's green, it's telling me that this hash matches the current state of the data that I see in the ledger that I'm now interacting with or making decisions on based as a business process owner. And the important thing is that if you then say, well, okay, well, let's say, for example, the Foxconn person goes back in here and changes this to be 10,000, or let's say 1,000. Now, first of all, within the Boardwalk environment, you're able to make it so that if something has been completed, it's locked down and nobody's able to make change. But just for sake of demonstration, if I go in and I say, well, you know, let's make a change here so we're able to invalidate the information that's already been submitted to the block, then you'll be able to see exactly how the whole hashing mechanism works to say, you know, has data changed? If I now come back and I rerun that same validation and I say, you know, has this data changed? It's now turning red because the data value that's inside the database does not reflect the most recent information that's been captured in the hash, which is what we're seeing here. So without having to go in and question, you know, where the data came from, because of this workflow consensus capability within smart contract, you're able to say, hey, does this reflect the information that I'm working with in the ledger? Is this the most recent information? Am I confident that this is the state of the information as of the time that, you know, I'm going to make decisions about automating payment or facilitating payment? And now by combining these two types of capabilities together, we're now able to provide a complete solution that has both the capabilities for working with the data, but also the capabilities associated with working with the blockchain. So why don't we kind of talk through, you know, the capabilities and summarize the capabilities in terms of the blockchain solution.
Thanks, JB. So if we look at, we sort of come back to where we started here. If you think about where we started, which was that, you know, blockchain is going to revolutionize business over time. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And at Boardwalk, we've been working for over 10 years with digital ledger-based applications. So we're very experienced in digital ledger-based applications and have now added blockchain capabilities as well. And so you get the ability to integrate with your existing processes. You get the ability to start from the inside out and move to a blockchain solution that will integrate with your processes and with other blockchain solutions over time. So we're really interested in working with companies who are looking for a way to get started with blockchain, have pain points in their processes and see blockchain and the use of a digital ledger as a way to improve the efficiency and effectiveness and execution of those operations that they have today. And typically the way that we work with companies is, companies come to us and they usually say, hey, I've got this particular area of my business where I'm having pain. It's usually a multi-party process where there's lots of manual interactions, lots of manual data handling, lots of spreadsheets being emailed around. And what we do is we work with them to identify what's a target model. What's a target model you're trying to move towards? And we can work with you then to build that out in a demonstration to say, okay, using the Boardwalk Digital Ledger, let's take a look at what this would look like. Let's talk about how blockchain is going to transform this particular application space that you have and build a business case around that. And that's how we begin the interaction with our clients. So we invite you to work with us, to reach out to us if you have a particular process you have in mind, you want to explore this further. We're happy to do specific calls with you to explore it and to move to the next step.
And with that, we're almost on the top of the hour. We have a lot of questions, but there's too many for us to be able to address right now because we're not going to have enough time. So as I said in the beginning, please put any questions that you have into the chat, and we will send you a separate email with an answer and or set up a phone call as appropriate. And certainly for anyone who would like to be able to find out more, you can reply to the invitation that you were sent. And we'd be glad to set up a one-on-one discussion with you to talk about, the challenges and capabilities and things that you're looking at in terms of your digital transformation and how, the Boardwalk solution that combines both digital transformation capabilities and blockchain into one solution can be applied to your specific business case and your specific business environment. So with that, we're going to end the webinar. We'd like to thank everybody for attending today. And we hope to connect with all of you individually to talk about how Boardwalk Enterprise Blockchain can be applied to address your ongoing business and making your business better. Thanks everybody for attending.